Welcome to Dead Man Talking. Tonight's story is a brand new and exclusive story from my good friend RICO, and I just know you guys are going to sink your teeth into this one. Of course, as ever though, please do let us know what you thought down below in the comments box. Please do like and share. It really does help both the channel and our community further. And why not hashtag TeamFEAR and DMT's Cryptid crew. And so, with that aside, let's get into tonight's story. And title: The Bloodlands. Let's get straight into that. Epilogue. They're oft a fine line between revenge and redemption. Part 1. The Beginning. In Northumbria lay the small Norman village. King Philip to the north had granted his Viking raiders this land after they fought him to defend his kingdom. These Vikings were no longer conquerors, nor did they seek to plunder. They were farmers or raised livestock. It had been about 10 years since the plague had passed and wiped out almost 1/3 of the populace. Mass grave sites and burn pits were still visible. And to the west lay the sparse red barren land without vegetation. The locals called it the Bloodlands because of the red or copper tint of the ground. Nothing but scrubs or weeds grew there, and nobody could figure out why this strange Romanian man chose to settle there. A dozen or so covered carts and wagons rolled in mostly at night. They contracted locals to help build a very simple, large, 2-story home, and with 10-foot-high timber walls around it that extended out about 100 feet from the house. The construction was done quickly, and the locals didn't complain because they were paid with gold. A few locals had met a couple of servants who contracted the work. Nobody had met the owner, and all they knew is that his name was Vostok. Shortly after the construction was completed, more wagons would occasionally be seen rolling up the long winding hill under the cover of darkness. During the day, the locals would occasionally notice that some small stone structures started popping up on the barren hillside outside the gate. There was an ominous look about this place, and the villagers tried to stay away. Children were told to never go there, as livestock along with people both young and old would occasionally go missing from surrounding farms or villages. Father David of the chapel near the castle gates feared the worst and believed this place to be of the devil. There were 2 homes that lay on the outskirts of the Norman village, uncomfortably near the Bloodlands. One was the home of Helga, whose husband had died of the plague several years earlier. Her husband raised horses for the king's soldiers, and Helga was a saddle maker. She was a tall, proud, statuesque Viking woman, whose mother had been a shield maiden. She now struggled to make ends meet with teenage daughter Lizzie. The king had become greedy and paid less for his horses and saddles while demanding more quality. Young Lizzie, now 15, was quite a beauty, tall like her mother and with long red hair and emerald green eyes. Nearby lived Olaf with his wife Ingrid and children Bjorn, Eric and toddler Gretchen. Olaf was a renowned Viking warrior and horseman. He tended his livestock and helped the struggling Helga to maintain a few horses that were left for small cuts of profits from sales of the king's men. King Dorian's greed had also made it more difficult for Olaf to sell his blacksmith goods to the king for a profit. Dorian was a handsome man who took power at age 30 after his wise father, King Marcus, had died from the plague several years earlier. Dorian was vain and more preoccupied with his own wealth than the plight of his people. His marriage to King Patrick's daughter was arranged, and Queen Olivia now seldom stayed in a place due to King Dorian having a fetish for young girls. When the Queen discovered the truth about him having numerous young ladies in waiting, most still teenagers, she left to stay with her father, King Philip, to the north. Young Bjorn was a tall and muscular 17-year-old with Scandinavian features. He was blonde with blue eyes, but his eyes were mostly focused on Lizzie when his father wasn't teaching him the blacksmith trade or swordsmanship. The two had grown up together, and there seemed to be a blooming childhood romance building between them. Many were sure that they would grow up and one day marry, but even though Lizzie really liked Bjorn, she had eyes for the city life. She would swoon at the king's knights who came to choose their horses. On occasion, her mother would take her to the city to purchase supplies. Lizzie's eyes were always fixed on the palace, and she would tell her mum that someday she would live there and be a princess. It was on one of these trips that King Dorian spied the young lass from his balcony. He was instantly filled with lust and had his chief servant go find out who this young girl was. After a brief conversation, the servant could tell that young Lizzie was a perfect candidate to groom as the king's next young concubine. The servant reported back to the king and devised a plan. The next time that there would be a purchase of horses, he would personally travel to Helga's and offer a premium price. He would then extend opportunity for an internship for Lizzie to work in the palace and receive an education fit for a princess. And 2 months later, the servant and 2 of the king's men came to inspect the horses and saddles for purchase. He offered 4 times the usual amount upon delivery. Helga was shocked and asked why. He responded that the king felt bad about her circumstance and to honour her husband and her hard work, and to please accept this generous payment. He also said that the king would like to extend a special offer to Lizzie to come live an apprentice in the palace and receive a proper education. Lizzie became ecstatic and her face lit up as she began to say, "Oh, mother, please, please, this is my dream." And over Helga's objections, she finally agreed. In about a month after the full harvest, she would take young Lizzie to live in the castle. Part 2. The Farewell. When young Bjorn learned that Lizzie would be going away to the castle, he was devastated. He didn't want to eat and had a hard time concentrating. At dinner, Father Olaf explained, "Son, this Jenta has material eyes. She would never make a good partner." Mother Ingrid put a hand on his face and said, "My son, she dreams of things that we cannot provide. I know you are heartbroken, but there are many fine girls who have eyes for my handsome young man. You just don't notice because you are so enamored with her." Bjorn hung his head. "Besides," said Olaf, "we have more things to be concerned about. There are reports of animals and even people missing." "What could it be?" said Ingrid. Young Eric blurted out, "Skraelings or possibly even drogs. That is what the old Volva says." And Olaf snapped, "Nonsense, don't listen to that old fool. He claims it is he who put a curse on the Bloodlands." And Ingrid said, "Mind your tongue, Eric, you're frightening Gretchen." But Bjorn stayed silent because he knew that he had seen something he could not explain moving through the trees while coming back from feeding the cattle one evening. "Let's change the subject," said Ingrid. "The harvest will be over this week and we must plan a going-away party for Lizzie." "Oh, I'm not going," said Bjorn. Olaf leaned over and said, "Son, part of being a man is showing respect when you don't like the circumstances." Bjorn held his head down and remained silent for the rest of the evening. And the party for Lizzie started at noon with a few families in attendance. Her mom presented a leather doll that she had made her before her father died. She cleaned it up and put a new handmade dress and ribbons in its hair. "Darling, take this as a reminder of your childhood." But Lizzie scowled and said, "Mother, it's a cheap doll. It will be an embarrassment for me in the palace." And you could see the sadness in Helga's eyes as she fought back her tears. But Lizzie immediately began chatting with her female friends and ignored her mum. Ingrid put her arms around Helga and said, "She is but a child and will one day covet this doll when she matures." And Helga nodded and returned the hug. It was now late afternoon when a horse-drawn coach accompanied by 4 of the king's men on horseback approached in the distance. Lizzie filled with excitement as she saw it slowly drawing near. She had hardly spoke a word to Bjorn the whole time. And as the coach drew up in front of the simple house, the king's servant and a handmaiden exited. They presented Lizzie with a fancy dress that she hurriedly went and changed into. She truly looked like a princess in this frilly green gown that almost matched her eyes. She hugged her mum for the last time and looked over to Bjorn. And she paused for a moment as if something tugged at her heart. She ran to him and threw her arms around his broad chest and said how she would always care for him and never forget the times they spent together growing up. She kissed his cheek, and Bjorn said, "Do you remember how, when I was little and couldn't talk plain, and you didn't like it when I called you Wizzy? For a moment, a tear formed in her eye, and she hugged him as if she would never see him again. Then she walked towards the coach. She put one foot on the coach, and then paused. She turned and looked at Bjorn and said, "You know, I bet one day you will be a prince." Then she entered the coach, and the door closed. Now her mother walked alongside for several steps, holding the door, but Lizzie was totally absorbed in the conversation with the handmaiden. And as the coach disappeared, Helga wept as Ingrid and the other women encircled her. Olaf and Ingrid had promised to help Helga as much as possible. Young Bjorn even promised to deliver the horses to the castle that the king had already paid for. These horses would be of age in the coming spring, and of course he secretly agreed to this in hopes of getting a glimpse of Lizzie. It was now late fall, and it appeared a cold winter was coming early. There continued to be sporadic reports of livestock taken, and occasionally mutilated carcasses were found. As the snow fell and the days shortened, it seemed that the nights were darker and longer than ever before. On occasions, unknown screeching sounds that were never before heard would now resonate through the hills. This sound chilled the Vikings more so than the cold winter nights. Late one bitter cold snow-blown night, in late February, a loud knock came on Olaf's door, waking he and Ingrid and Bjorn. It was Harold, one of Olaf's oldest friends, accompanied by 5 other men with torches and primitive lanterns. "What brings you here in this freezing midnight hour?" said Olaf. "The Nadson's 2-year-old son has been taken from his crib. The mother said 2 slight creatures burst through the window grabbing him, and then scurried away, barely making a sound. All that was heard was the child's screams for a few seconds, and then complete silence. Now the father and the small group are following tracks that lead into the Bloodlands, but we must hurry before the blowing snows covers all sign." Young Bjorn was up getting dressed, but his father insisted he stay home and protect the family, for little Gretchen might be at risk. "I'll go with him, son. Ready your bow and your sword." Bjorn understood and reluctantly agreed. The tracks disappeared before reaching the Bloodlands, and no sign of the child was ever found. Part 3. The Heartbreak. Let's get straight into that. Now the seasons had changed, and it was now early April, and time for Bjorn to deliver the horses to the king's guard. He had looked forward to this trip for a while and would wear his best clothes in hopes of impressing Lizzie should he see her. He was charged with delivering 3 horses, but could not leave until late afternoon due to his chores, and so this would be an overnight trip, and because his mother didn't want him travelling at night, he would stay with Father David at the chapel. He hugged his mom and little Gretchen, and left as the sun slowly crept down upon the trees. His 4-hour journey would put him there after dark by the time he reached the chapel, which was on the outskirts of town by the main road. An ominous blood-red moon rose that put a bit of a chill into Bjorn's spine, but the warm sight of so many candles burning in the chapel windows, it was a welcome sight as it came into view. As Bjorn dismounted and tied up the horses at the gate, he was met by the welcome sight of Father David approaching with open arms and a big hug. He called for the young intern to stable the horses and led Bjorn inside for a meal. "You have grown so much larger and stronger since the last harvest, when I saw you. How is your family?" "They are well, Father, but can you tell me if you've heard anything about Lizzie?" And the father hung his head for a moment, not knowing how to properly explain the situation without breaking young Bjorn's spirits. "Well, I haven't specifically heard anything about Lizzie, but I did see her one time and she looked well. But you must know that there are rumors about King Dorian and his desire for the company of young girls." Bjorn looked puzzled for a moment, and then the gravity of what Father David said sunk in. He was enraged and stood up as if he would rush out the door towards the castle. Father David calmed him down and convinced him that he will inquire about Lizzie tomorrow. "You must rest so we can get up early to deliver the horses. In the meantime, let us pray about the darkness that has descended upon the Bloodlands and the surrounding area. Father, are the rumors about the Skrelians and Draugs true? Bjorn, there are some things that are hard to comprehend about the evil that has descended upon the Bloodlands. Did you know that it was once a plush green landscape, with a church sitting on a hill that I helped build when I was about your age?" Bjorn looked surprised and said that his father had told him about the Volva, and that it had put a curse on our land many years ago. The father hesitated for a moment and then replied, Even that old witch cannot claim responsibility for what was happening there. Come on, it's bedtime and there is much more for us to discuss tomorrow." Bjorn's mind raced and he barely slept for worrying about Lizzie. And what sleep he did get was restless and full of strange dreams about a man with a hooded cloak holding an unusual sword. Many miles away on the far side of the Bloodlands sat an old run-down farmhouse. The cries and sobs of a young girl emanated from within. It was Lizzie, and she was in great pain as she lay in her old bed, bent over at the waist and clutching her stomach. On her second week at the castle, King Dorian was overcome by his lust for her and began raping her nightly. And she had gotten pregnant, and just as many other girls before her, he had put her away in this old farmhouse and with this evil old woman.
"Hush your cries, lass. You're one of the lucky ones,"
said the old witch, Lucinda.
"You are about to have a miscarriage and you can go back home after it's over."
Lizzie screamed out in rage of pain and sadness. "This wasn't supposed to be happening to me. That bastard has ruined my life." Lucinda responded,
"Yes, lass, you and many more."
"Why do you do this for him?" screamed Lizzie.
"Well, lassie, everybody has to make a living," she replied with an evil smile.
And Lizzie began praying, but not to God. She began praying to anyone or anything that would listen. "Please, I will do anything for anybody if you give me a chance for revenge." And she repeated this many times as Lucinda chuckled, saying,
"Don't waste your breath, lassie. Nobody is listening."
But Lizzie's cries and pleas grew stronger and more impassioned as her pain and desperation intensified. She thought of her mother, she thought of Bjorn, she thought of how her dreams were crushed. But most of all, she thought about how she would do anything for a chance to butcher King Dorian. And suddenly, a cold wind hit the old farmhouse, causing the timbers to creak, and the window shutters flew open. The front door opened, and an ominous voice said, "Lucinda, who do you have here?"
"Another one of the king's young whores," she replied.
"No, I believe this one is different. I believe this one will serve me." Lizzie was suddenly stricken with fear as a shadow filled the doorway to her room. It was a tall, pale man with jet black hair and a sinister look on his face. "Who are you?" said Lizzie as she strained to look at him in the dim light. "I am Count Vostok, and I hear you will do anything for revenge upon the king." "Yes," she screamed in desperation as the pain increased. "I'll do anything you want." "Then drink this," he said as he presented a bottle with a dark tonic. She drank, and in minutes she fell into a deep sleep. He then put his hand on her stomach and summoned Lucinda. And she responded,
"What shall I do with the remains of the bastard child?"
Vostok smiled. "Some of my horde is waiting outside. Throw it to them and we can watch them fight over it." He looked up at Lucinda, and his dark, sunken eyes were now red. Part 4. The Carnage. Father David and Bjorn rose early for the short trip to the king's stables. Upon arrival, Father David told Bjorn to conduct his business and collect payment while he went inside the castle gates. "Meet me there later. I know somebody I can ask about Lizzie." Bjorn nodded, and the father set out for the castle. In about an hour, Bjorn joined him near the gates. I'm sorry, Bjorn, but nobody seems to know anything, and the last person to see Lizzie says it was over a week ago." Bjorn shook his head at the sound of men shouting, and several horses approached. It was 3 men from the Norman village who Bjorn knew. They were frantic and looking for Father David. As the crowd gathered, one man spotted the father and fell weeping at his feet. "Oh my God," he said. "'Tis a slaughter." His arm panted and tried to talk. It was then that Bjorn's eyes met Harold's standing back in the crowd. He instantly felt panic as he ran to Harold. Harold embraced him as Bjorn demanded to know what had happened. Father David drew near with Arn and looked at Bjorn with tears in his eyes. Bjorn screamed, "Somebody tell me what is going on!" Father David took his hand as the crowd now gathered around. "Bjorn, something terrible has happened at your house and Helga's. They are gone. They are all gone." "No!" shouted Bjorn, and he ran for his horse. Harold quickly followed and mounted his horse along with the remaining men to accompany Bjorn. Arn would stay to explain what had happened to the King's Guard. By the time Harold and Magnus caught up to Bjorn, they were halfway to his house. They slowed him down a bit and convinced him not to run the horse into the ground. They arrived at a farm as the sun shone directly overhead. The scene outside was bad, with chickens and goats slaughtered, but this scene could not match what awaited Bjorn on the inside. Harold tried to hold the burly young man back, but he was like a charging bull as he entered the house. The door was off its hinges, and things were strewn about as if there had been a war here. His mother lay by the fireplace, covered in blood, with huge gashes in her neck and chest. Next to her, on the floor, lay the beheaded corpse of a disfigured man. Eric's bed was full of blood, but he and Gretchen, well, they were nowhere to be found, and neither was Olaf. "Where is my father?" screamed Bjorn. "Come with me," said Harold, as he led Bjorn up a trail towards a hillside. Olaf's body lay next to a strange, decapitated, pale, wrinkled man, still gripping his sword. Olaf also bore the same wounds as his mother and was covered in dried blood. The young Bjorn sunk to his knees and wept. And more people from the Norman village were now arriving to comfort Bjorn and help clean up the mess. A search party had tried to track the assailants, but all signs abruptly ended deep in the forest. In the distance was the sound of several of the King's Guard, followed by Father David in a horse-drawn wagon with the town physician, Dr. Leo. Bjorn was now crumpled on the stoop in front of his house. As Father David rushed to comfort him, Bjorn looked up with tears flowing and asked, "What are those things that my father killed?" Dr. Leo and two of the King's Guard were led to the location of the bodies by Harold. "We will find out," said the father. "For now you must come stay with me. I cannot leave the farm. My father, he would want me to take care of." Magnus knelt down. "Bjorn, everything is gone, except for some cows and your father's horse. We will take care of them. Please, go stay with Father David." Father David responded, "Is someone taking care of Helga's remaining horses?" "Yes," said Magnus. "Well said, Father. I must go there and pray, but first I must bless this place with holy water and prayer. We must bury the dead." Dr. Leo approached and said, "Yes, we must burn those abominations." Now the villagers gathered to lay Ingrid and Olaf to rest on the hill overlooking the farm. Father David said, "Bjorn, get your belongings. It is very important that you come with me." It was now late evening as Bjorn tied his horse to the back of Father David's wagon and lay down on the hay. The King's Guard accompanied him back to the chapel. "Dr. Leo," Bjorn asked, "have you ever seen anything like those creatures?" And the doctor hesitated and responded, "Well, they resemble the bodies of those who died from the plague, but I don't understand how they were able to do what they did." Bjorn began to sob as he recalled hugging little Gretchen. Father David replied, "It may not make you feel any better right now, but I can assure you your family is in Abraham's bosom as we speak." "That may be true, Father, but whatever, or whoever did this, they must pay." Now a look fell upon Bjorn's face that made him appear to be much older than his youthful 17 years, and his persona completely changed. while Father David and 2 of the King's Guard stopped to bless Helga's home and perform the burial. Bjorn picked up Lizzie's doll and clutched it. It was nightfall as the wagon pulled up to the castle gate for Dr. Leo to get out. He wished Bjorn well and promised to check in on him. Bjorn was completely silent during the short trip back to the chapel. Young intern Thomas put away the horses and wagon as Father David and Bjorn made their way inside. They sat down for a meal and Bjorn barely ate. Father David spoke.
Bjorn, there is much I have to tell you, and it won't be easy. You were adopted after being found in an old church that once sat on the Bloodlands. Bjorn's eyes flew open. You have a birthmark, do you not? On your left chest, over your heart. Is it a crude star with a cross inside it? Yes. How did you know? Because it is I who found you, and took you to Olaf and Ingrid. The old evil Volva made a deal with the devil to curse that land to prevent the missionaries from finding a church there. An unusual winter lightning storm destroyed the church. I was there hiding in fear until I heard a baby crying. This baby was lying on the altar with an unusual cloak wrapped around it, and with a black sword and dagger next to it. That baby was you, and the cloak was made of a strange material, and it has 2 slits in the back. What is its purpose? Said Bjorn. I do not know, but it protected you from the fire. Bjorn puzzled over this as the father said, Watch. Father David presented a cloak and held a torch to it, and it would not catch fire. We have even tried to pierce it with a bow and arrow to no avail. Bjorn, you must tell no one about this cloak. The king will confiscate it immediately. This is too much for me. Olaf and Ingrid are my parents. Yes, they are. Mom Sully, their firstborn son, died in childbirth. They instantly fell in love with you and raised you as their own. But have you ever wondered why you were stronger and bigger, and with better eyesight, better hearing? Your father said that when you were hunting, you could sense the animals, or even people, before anybody saw or heard them. I don't understand. This is too much. Part 5. The Manor. Lizzie woke up in a dark room laying upon musty-smelling quilts of a creaky bed. The pain in her abdomen was now gone, but her head throbbed. There were black curtains over the window, and the light was dim. Although it felt like morning, there was a feel of perpetual darkness to this place. But her eyes could see well, and she could hear distant muffled voices as if they were next to her. She shot up in bed as a knock came on the door, and a voice from outside said, Madame Elizabeth, the master requests you at the breakfast table. Elizabeth was her given name, but nobody had called her by that name since her grandmother. She wasn't weak from her ordeal, and felt energized in a way that she never had. When she emerged from the bedroom to the dim lights in the hallway, she realized that she was upstairs in that old house. She could see that she was dressed in knee-high black leather boots and blood-red silk pants. She also had a fine long-sleeved white silk blouse and with ruffles in the sleeves. She made her way down the steps, feeling graceful like a ballerina. She felt as if she had almost floated. The smell of cooked food filled the air. A small, pale-skinned man met her and said, This way, Madam Elizabeth, and led her into a large dining room and seated her at the end of a long table. He then went to the other end and slid out a chair as a tall, dark-haired man from the old witch's house entered and took his seat. He looked at the servant and said, That is all. Leave us. Madame Elizabeth, I am Count Vostok, and you are at the Bloodlands Manor. Unlike your stay with King Dorian, you are free to go, and you are free to stay. But if you will have your revenge, you must stay and serve me. Well, Elizabeth responded, But I need to see my mother. I don't understand how I can serve you. My dear, I am sorry to inform you that your mother is dead. She went to the castle, demanded to see you, and met an ill fate. The king sent his men to take the rest of her horses. Lizzie was enraged and her hatred for the king grew stronger. Vostok sat about 10 feet away, and a small smile formed at one corner of his mouth. "Dear Elizabeth, you must be famished. Please eat." In front of her was apparently wine and meat cooked rare, but she ate it ravenously. And as she ate, she felt even stronger, and she felt her hate for the king Dorian grow. "What is happening to me?" she asked. Vostok summoned the servant with a mirror and gave it to Lizzie. She stared dumbfounded at her reflection. Her emerald green eyes were now black. Her once red flowing hair was now white, and her brow thickened as sinister wrinkles covered her face. Lizzie stood up and screamed, "What have you done to me?" Vostok replied, "I have granted your wish. You wanted vengeance, and I have provided the means." She sat back down and calmed herself. Vostok leaned forward and said, "Did you not want to be a princess? Now you have the chance to be a queen." "What? A queen of the damned?" she responded. "You don't understand. What you see here is only temporary. When our work is done, you will live in a palace with all the servants and fine things you can ever dream of." "And what must I do?" she responded. "First, you must prove yourself by carrying out a few simple tasks. Once you have completed these tasks, you will become my queen. When we consummate our relationship, you will have more power than you could ever dream of. You can make King Dorian your pet, or you can shred him to pieces. It does not matter to me. He is a weak fool who has allowed himself to disgrace the kingdom his father built." "So, what do you want me to do?" said Lizzie. "Help me feed my horde and spread my kingdom beyond this barren hill. Help me lure some villagers here. Some will be food, some will become subjects. You are much stronger than my horde, and with your looks, you will be like a siren, pulling the stronger men here for me to convert." But I look evil," she responded. "Look at yourself in the mirror again." Although her hair was still white, her beautiful face had returned. She was puzzled, and Vostok said, "Hunger or anger will contort your face. Keep your beauty by quenching your hunger. Please eat more. Soon you will crave more than meat from cattle. You will crave human flesh, and your transformation will be complete." Lizzie ate and drank her fill, not knowing that the wine contained a human blood concoction. Now full, Lizzie asked, "Who are you really, and how did all this happen?" "I am Count Vostok, and I was a physician and alchemist to the Romanian throne. When the plague struck, the king's family started dying, and he told me that he would reward me with anything my heart desired if I could find a cure. I began to experiment with cadavers who had died from the plague, and then I contracted the disease, and I knew that I was going to die, so I began experimenting upon myself. But nothing worked, and I became weak and desperate. One night a knock came on my laboratory door, and it was an impeccably dressed man who said he could help me find a cure. But there was a condition, that I must work for him, and I could have my own kingdom. I agreed, and he gave me a vial of liquid to mix with infected blood. What I found was a serum that transformed me into a god. And as I grew stronger, I kept my word to the king. I injected his young son with the serum, but it was too much. The child became a monster, trying to attack everybody, even his mother and father. The king had to kill his own son, and then turned his rage upon me. I killed the king and his guards, and then I went into hiding. When I came here, I heard that there was an old wizard who despised the church and wanted to keep the old ways and worship the old gods.
He claimed he knew a blood spell that would curse the land that the first church was built upon. What he lacked was the right blood for the spell. I provided my blood, and he performed his spell and sprinkled my blood around the church. That cold night, an incredible thunderstorm came. The wizard was sure that a lightning was sent from the gods. And then a terrifying bolt of lightning came and destroyed the entire church, except for the altar. I must admit, we ran for our lives. But the very next day, the grass and vegetation began to die, and the area began taking on a copper color. The church was abandoned, and I made a generous offer in gold to buy the land. Several villagers were also glad to build this house for a few pieces of gold. And after that, I slowly began to build my kingdom and usher in my flock. I selectively picked people who lived alone or were homeless. I fed them food with my serum, and over the years they became my subjects and brought me more followers.
Part 6. The Avenger. Let's get straight into that. As Bjorn awoke from another sleepless night, full of strange dreams, Father David knocked on the door. "Come get breakfast, Bjorn. We have much to discuss." At the table, Bjorn handed Father David the money from the sale of the horses. "Here," he said. "I'm sure Miss Helga would want the church to have it." The father nodded and smiled, saying, "You have a good heart, young Bjorn. But today we have some chores that may be difficult." Father David had the wagon ready and brought a bundle containing a cloak, sword, and dagger. "Come, Bjorn. We are going to a secluded place, and on the way I must tell you the rest of your story." Now the wagon left the chapel and turned onto a narrow path a few miles from town. Father David said, "Listen to me, Bjorn. This won't be easy for you. You know how I told you I'd found you and took you to Olaf and Ingrid?" Bjorn nodded, and the father continued. "What I didn't tell you is that I was staying at the church. On that night I heard a chanting sound and peeped out of the window to see the old vulva and the strange man spreading something onto the ground. It was only minutes until I heard what I thought was impossible, an extremely loud crack of thunder in the dead of winter, followed by heavy rain and lightning. For fear of my own life, I curled up in the corner of the cellar and began to recite the Lord's Prayer. A bolt of lightning hit the church and shattered the very foundation. And I heard the sound of things crumbling around me, and suddenly there was silence. Silence, except for the sound of a baby crying. I dug out from under the rubble, and to my amazement, the only thing left standing was the altar. And there, on the altar, was a baby, wrapped in this strange cloak, lying next to the sword and dagger. The closest house was Olaf and Ingrid. It was dark when I knocked on the door and presented my small bundle. Ingrid immediately took the baby from me, and I told them the story. They agreed they would say that they didn't know Ingrid was pregnant and had this baby prematurely. Now the village was so sparsely populated at that time that they probably wouldn't see any people until spring anyway. And so, Bjorn, that is your story. Now Bjorn sat in silence on the wagon as Father David pulled up into the clearing on a hill. "This is as far as we go," said the father, and grabbed the bundle. Now they walked for a while until they reached the top of this big hill, and Father David laid the bundle on the ground at Bjorn's feet and backed away. "Young Bjorn, I do not know what will happen, but you must put this cloak on and take this sword in hand." When the father was what he felt a safe distance away, he nodded at Bjorn and said, "Go ahead. It is your destiny now." And Bjorn bent over and slowly unwrapped the cloak, hesitating for a moment. He put it on and took the old black sword in hand, and within seconds his body writhed with pain, and he was thrown to the ground by some unseen force. He came up on one knee, holding the sword's hilt in one hand, and with the point to the ground. The hood from the cloak was now over his head, and with his chin in his chest. The sword started to shimmer, and the letters and etchings on the blade were now clear to see. The material of the cloak seemed to glow as etchings on the fabric also appeared. The cloak seemed to be alive, and suddenly a bolt of lightning struck the ground. A set of wings started to protrude from the slits in the back of the cloak, and Bjorn suddenly stood up. He pulled back the garment over his left breast, and the birthmark was now glowing white. Bjorn's eyes wide and glowed white also. He held the sword over his head and took 2 large steps to the left, where he cleaved the 6-inch tree in half. And Bjorn was no longer the young boy that came to this hilltop. Father David slowly approached. "Bjorn? Bjorn, do you hear me? It's Father David." And Bjorn slowly turned his head and said, Yes, it is you, the one who was ordained to find me." The father nodded his head and said, "Yes, somehow I know that too. So tell me, Bjorn, what is our next step?" "Father, I am confused, and I feel that I must be alone for a while, here in the forest to find myself, to find my purpose and discover my abilities." "I understand, my son. You know you always have a place to stay with me." Bjorn smiled and said, "I will see you at the appropriate time. There are many things I must learn, many things to discover. I will fast and meditate. It's like many voices are in my head telling me different things." Father David smiled and said, "Bjorn, your voice has changed. It's much deeper now. Your face has matured and you no longer look like a teenager. I believe you have grown a few inches and put on a few pounds. You must be at least 6.5 feet tall now." And Bjorn nodded and said, "Thank you, Father. Thank you for all you have done. But you must leave me now. This part of the journey is for me to take alone." Father David nodded and said, "Godspeed, Bjorn. My doors and my arms are always open for you." And Bjorn slowly walked into the forest and disappeared into the foliage. Father David now headed back to the wagon for his return trip to the chapel. Part 7. The Siren. Madame Elizabeth wore a black cloak with a hood over her head to protect her sensitive skin from sunlight. Count Vostok chose not to come out at all during the day because the light was too much for his eyes and skin. Elizabeth mounted a horse and slowly rode about the countryside in search of the weak and vulnerable, or some lonely man who would become amorous at the sight of her. Rumours grew about the tall, beautiful, white-haired woman who rode through the countryside. One by one, men fell into her trap. She would flirt and entice them to a private place, but she would render them unconscious and then take them back to the manor, bound and tied. One night at the dinner table, Count Vostok stood and raised a glass in toast to Madame Elizabeth. She also rose to hear him say the following: "My ranks have swollen, and you have brought many subjects into the fold. But there is only one more thing I need before you become my queen, and you get your vengeance upon King Dorian. I want Father David from the town chapel brought to me." Lizzie felt sick at the prospect of doing this to the man who had baptized her as a child. "But, my lord, why Father David? Why not anybody else? Besides, have I not abducted anybody near the city? What if I'm spotted or captured?" Vostok scowled and said, "My dear Elizabeth, are you having second thoughts about your heartfelt desire to school the man who held you down and raped you, then bound and sodomized you? And please do not forget what he did to your dear mother." Lizzie felt a surge of pure rage run through her veins as her blood pressure rose. She could almost taste the hatred in her mouth as she raised her glass and drank, saying, Yes, I will do this, my lord, and my king." Vostok smiled and drank again. "Please, my love, sit, eat, and drink, for tomorrow you make your plan to abduct the Father while he sleeps in his very sanctuary.
It was late evening at the chapel when a loud knock came to the door. Father David felt in his heart that he knew who was there. He opened the door to the smiling face of Bjorn. They embraced, and the father led him into the kitchen. It had been almost a month. "Oh, you must be starved."
"Yes, I am," said Bjorn. "On the way here, I thought about this very kitchen."
The father quickly sat out a feast, and Bjorn ate almost everything.
"So, tell me, my son, how are you? Are things clearer now?" "Yes, father. There is an evil in the Bloodlands that must be cleansed."
The father nodded and said,
"I have disturbing news. A strange and sinister but beautiful young woman rides through the countryside on a white horse, enticing young men, and, well, they never return. Young girls are also suspected to have been taken by her. Even the old and sick are missing. The villagers are in fear, and many patrol the area at night to protect their families. Also, King Dorian has fallen ill, and some think that one of his young victims may have poisoned him."
Bjorn nodded.
"Yes, I have heard, and I fear that I know who this strange and beautiful Siren is."
And the father was silent as he stared at Bjorn. And Bjorn hung his head and said,
"My heart of hearts tells me that it is Lizzie. My very soul is vexed."
And Father David's eyes flew wide in disbelief.
"How can this be? This woman is reported to have white hair and dark eyes. She wears knee-high leather boots and fine riding garments under a black hooded cloak."
Bjorn responded,
"She became pregnant after King Dorian violated her. He put her away to have a child, and, well, something terrible happened. In her anger and pain, she may have made a deal, an agreement with an evil that we do not understand." "What can I do?" said the father. "I know you are friends with the head of the King's Guard. Seek him out and beseech him for help." "Yes, you mean Captain Gerard? He is a good man of honor who understands what a wretch the king has become." "Well, ask if he can be prepared to send troops to the Bloodlands, if necessary. Most of all, see if he can post some guards here at night. I fear that you are in danger." "God will protect me," said the father. And Bjorn grasped his hand and said, "What is it that you used to tell me? God accomplishes his works through those who believe."
Father David smiled and said,
"So, you were listening to at least one sermon." "Tonight, father, I would like to sleep in a bed, but tomorrow I need my horse and a few supplies and a bedroll before I head to the Bloodlands." "Of course, my son," said the father. "And tomorrow morning I will see Captain Gerard."
Early the next morning before dawn, Father David awoke to the sound of Bjorn riding away on his horse. The father made it a point to go see the captain first. They discussed the troubling events, and Captain Gerard agreed that he should post 2 guards at the chapel for a while. He also agreed to prepare a troop of his men to inspect the situation at the Bloodlands. And since the king had fell ill, he hardly took notice or paid attention to events. On the first night at the chapel was uneventful for the guards, but from a distance Madame Elizabeth hid in the shadows, formulating her plan. The following night, Father David made sure to pray for Bjorn and the people in the countryside. He even said a prayer for Lizzie and asked for a miracle to deliver her. It was now bedtime, and the interns blew out all of the candles, and the chapel was almost dark. At the front entrance, 2 guards arrived at their appointed time for their all-night shift. Lizzie tied her horse far away from the chapel, but for her it was just a short run. With her newly found strength, she had thrown many of her men over her shoulder and made away with them. Father David was a small man and would be of no consequence for her. Lizzie now crept closer to the chapel. She decided she would scale the wall, using her hard 1-inch nails to grip the stones in the wall. She climbed silently like a cat until she reached a window in the middle of the chapel's top floor. And the shutters were closed, but her long nails jimmied the latch. She opened the shutter and crept silently down the hall,
using her keen night vision. She quietly opened the door and discovered the two interns sleeping. The next room must be Father David's, but how would she escape with him? She opened the door and there lay this kind man. She was about to do the unthinkable, but she mustn't allow emotion to stop her from her mission. She was now mostly a creature of the night, doing Vostok's bidding. She was about to become a queen and exact her vengeance upon King Dorian. And she crept silently to the bed and rolled up Father David in a blanket and wrapped her rope around him. She gagged his mouth with a cloth and tied it off along with the rope. And all that was heard was Father David's muffled screams as the interns ran out to see this tall woman running down the back steps and with the father over her shoulder. They ran screaming to the front entrance and alerted the guards. One guard ran quickly to tell the night guard at the gate. The other guard ran as fast as he could, but this woman, she ran like a deer, and he could not catch up at all. All he heard was the muffled pleas for help and the sound of the horse riding away. Part 8. The Horde. Let's get straight into that. Bjorn left his horse in the thick trees near the Bloodlands. He would go on foot and figure a way to confront Vostok. And as he stealthily crept among the rocks, he could smell the death and rot in the air. He would occasionally see figures moving in the distance, but wanted to avoid detection as long as possible. In the distance, he could hear the heavy footfalls of a horse approaching rapidly. He hid behind some boulders and tuned his senses to other sounds and smells in the area. He crept, seeing perfectly in the darkness, until the manor came into sight. There were many candles and even torches burning outside. This was unusual because he had reconned this place many times, learning the layout. But tonight, he sensed something different in the air. An approaching horse had now slowed and was coming up the narrow trail that led to the manor. People or creatures were now starting to emerge from the stone structures dotting the hillside. And suddenly he heard the distressed voice of Father David. He was on this horse saying, "Please, Lizzie, this isn't you. Let us stop and pray." A crass voice that did not sound like Lizzie, he knew, responded. "It is too late for that, Father. I must deliver you to the Master." And Father David then cried out, "Please, God, have mercy upon her soul." And as she knocked him unconscious, Bjorn's mind raced as he prayed at the same time, not knowing what to do next. The horse was now slowly ambling up this hill, no more than 100 feet from him. He could rush Lizzie and knock her off the horse and make her run for it on her horse with the father. But dozens of these night creatures would swarm him, and while he fought them, Father David might perish. There was only one thing he could do, and that was to confront Lizzie, or the person he used to know as Lizzie. And as the horse drew within 10 feet, Bjorn stepped out onto the trail with his cloak over his head. Lizzie froze, and for the first time in a while she felt true fear. At that instant, several of the creatures rushed Bjorn from all 3 sides. Bjorn drew his sword, and it shimmered and seemed to reflect upon his cloak. The first 2 creatures to meet him were immediately decapitated at the waist. One from the other side had its neck snapped as it tried to jump onto his shoulder. The others now stopped their advance as they saw what had happened. They gazed at the sword as it shimmered in unearthly colours. Suddenly he felt something hit his back, and sharp teeth tried to penetrate his cloak. He reached around, grabbing a handful of thick white hair, and flung Lizzie to the ground. And there was total silence now. She looked up at him and was astonished over what had just happened. She squinted her eyes, trying to make out his face as he pulled back his hood. "I feel like I know you. Who are you?" And Bjorn responded, "What's the matter, Wizzy? Have you forgotten me?" And her black eyes flew open along with her mouth, exposing her sharp teeth. "Why, how is this possible?" she said. "Oh, but it is. I am here to rescue you and end this evil." And she hung her head and said, "It's too late for me," and tensed her body like she was about to pounce when and Bjorn pulled something from inside his cloak. It was the doll that Lizzie's mother made for her, and Bjorn threw it to the ground in front of her. She saw it and immediately began to weep, clutching the doll. Her eyes started to turn back to the normal colour. Even tints of red were appearing in her hair. Then she shook her head and said, "Bjorn, I must kill King Dorian for raping and killing my mother. That's all that matters."
"Lizzie, it was Vostok's Horde that killed your mother and my family on the same night. I saw the carnage. It was not the king's doing. And besides, he's very sick. They believe that one of his young victims may have found a way to poison him."
Her eyes flew open, and a different kind of rage filled her. Father David was now awake and spoke from the back of the horse. "Lizzie, please. You have been bringing innocent people here to help Vostok build an army of bloodthirsty night creatures. It's not too late to stop, and it's not too late for you to right the wrongs you have committed. Search your heart. You know that Bjorn loved you, and through some divine miracle he is here to save you." She hung her head as more of her humanity crept back in. But that moment was cut short by the evil voice of Count Vostok as he shouted at his minions to attack. Captain Gerard and 40 of his best men were now riding like the wind for the Bloodlands. The thundering sounds of their hooves would have been audible to Bjorn, but he was now rushed by dozens of these creatures of all shapes and sizes. Vostok leapt at least 30 feet through the air, landing in front of Lizzie. He backhanded her, knocking her with such force that her feet left the ground, and she came to a rest on a large stone. He loomed over her and said,
"How dare you betray me? I was giving you everything you ever wanted."
She screamed,
"You lied to me! Your monsters killed my mother and Bjorn's family!"
She seethed with a righteous indignation that she had never felt before. She pulled her knees up to her chest and let out a double kick with all her might that sent Vostok 10 feet through the air. Vostok was totally caught by surprise as he shot to his feet. His eyes glowed red with anger as he shouted, "I will gut you like a pig." He pulled a saber from his belt and lunged for Lizzie, but before he could swing down upon her, Bjorn stepped in front with his sword and blocked it. He threw a large dagger to Lizzie and said, "Help me out with these creatures. Vostok is mine." Lizzie leapt from behind Bjorn with his dagger in hand and started dispatching the horde one by one as Bjorn and Vostok squared off. Unknown to any of them, Lizzie's horse had become spooked and ran down the hill with Father David still tied on. And over the sound of him being bounced breathless by the horse, he could hear the sound of many hooves thundering towards him. The horse instinctively ran towards the road leading to town and approaching the king's guard. Part 9. The Sacrifice. Vastly outnumbered by the bloodthirsty creatures, Lizzie fought on, even crushing skulls with rocks, stabbing hearts or slicing necks with Bjorn's dagger. Vostok stared at Bjorn and said, "Child, you are about to lose your life, and I will eat your heart before you take your last breath." Vostok swung his saber, but Bjorn blocked it. However, his long claws scratched the side of Bjorn's face, leaving bloody marks. Vostok jumped over Bjorn's head and headed for Lizzie, but Bjorn swung his sword, putting a deep cut in the back of Vostok's leg. And as he tumbled to the ground, he ordered all of the horde to attack Bjorn. About 2 or 3 miles from the trail to the Bloodlands, the king's guard met Father David and loosed him. Captain Gerard led his men up the trail, ready for battle, and with Father David lagging behind. Dozens of the creatures piled on top of Bjorn as he struggled and fought. It looked like a pile of ants, with one occasionally being ejected from the fray, covered in blood. Vostok now had one hand around Lizzie's neck and the other around the wrist that held the dagger. He picked her up off the ground as she struggled and tightened his grip around her neck. At that instant, a huge sound erupted from behind Vostok as many creatures flew through the air. Bjorn's wings erupted through the slits in the back of his cloak. He stood tall, and an eerie glow emanated from him. Vostok was obviously frightened at the sight, and loosened his grip on Lizzie, allowing her to fall to the ground, gasping for air. Bjorn rose in the air and swooped down on Vostok, swinging his sword. Vostok tried to block it, but Bjorn's sword severed his saber. The Horde began to run downhill to meet the King's Guard as they dismounted. Lizzie still had the dagger waiting for an opportunity to skewer Vostok. Bjorn now landed in front of the horrified Vostok. Bjorn raised the sword over his head and cleaved it down through Vostok's left shoulder, stopping at his right hip. He withdrew the blade as Vostok's face had a look of horror. His body separated into two pieces as he fell to the ground. And Lizzie took the dagger and cut out his heart. As the battle raged down the hill, Bjorn fell to his knees and the wings retracted into his back. Lizzie ran to him, throwing her arms around him. Father David arrived as the King's Guards were dispatching the remaining creatures. The three embraced and the father offered a prayer of thanks. He then looked at Lizzie and said, "You must expel any evil left inside you," and poured a small vial of holy water upon her. She became weak and fell on her side, and Bjorn placed his hand upon her head. She started violently vomiting the dark liquid. They held her as this went on for several minutes, and she finally began to dry heave, and it was over. Her eyes were slowly beginning to turn green. Her hair was slowly turning red again. Captain Gerard arrived, and Father David said, "You must search the manor and then burn it to the ground." And he turned to Bjorn and insisted that they get Lizzie back to the chapel. And back at the chapel, Lizzie was regaining her strength and preoccupied thinking about what the king had done to her and her mother. "What is it that you really want?" said Bjorn. Lizzie responded, "I still want justice for what happened to me, but I want to be with you also." And Bjorn responded, "I'm not even sure if that's possible now." And she laid her head on his shoulder and cried. In her heart, she still wanted revenge on the king. And Bjorn said, "What if I can get you inside the palace to confront the king?" "How?" she said. After the midnight hour, they walked out behind the chapel. Bjorn knelt, and suddenly his wings began to grow. To Lizzie's astonishment, he wrapped his arms around her, and they took flight. They landed on the castle balcony in front of the king's room, and they quietly entered and crept up to the king's bedside. "Who is there?" said the king. Bjorn immediately put his large hand over his mouth and said, "Be quiet if you want to live." Now the king was frail and frightened, and didn't even resemble the handsome man he once was. His eyes were cloudy, his vision was weak. And Bjorn handed Lizzie his dagger as she bent over him and pulled a large candle close. She looked into his face and said, "Do you remember what you did to me? Do you remember having my mother killed?" Dorian tensed as Lizzie pushed the sharp point of the dagger against his throat until a few drops of blood began to stream down on the bed. And he trembled and said, "Please, don't kill me. Please." "Please," she responded. "The same way I said please and begged you not to brutalize me." "I am sorry. Please forgive me. I'll do whatever you ask." And Lizzie started to push the blade into his throat, but then hesitated. Bjorn said, "There is oft a fine line between revenge and redemption. On which side of this line will you stand?" She withdrew the blade and turned to Bjorn and said, "Please, get me out of here." Bjorn bent over King Dorian and said, "Do something good in what time you have left. The poison in your body is weak compared to the poison in your soul." And with that, they returned to the balcony and flew away. Waking up to the breakfast at the chapel felt almost like home to Lizzie and Bjorn, but Lizzie still had an appetite for meat cooked rare, and Father David's eyes widened as she tore into her food. "What will you two do now?" said the father. "Well," said Lizzie, "I'd like to go home to my mother's house for a while." Bjorn said he would like to return to his house also. "Maybe we can be farmers again," they said. Father David told him that Captain Gerard found a lot of gold at the manor and gave a big share to the church. He would happy to be invested in the two and get their feet again. That evening Bjorn and Lizzie sat behind the church under the stars. "When will we tell the father that I still have the powers?" said Lizzie.
"I have a feeling he already knows," said Bjorn. "But I think he believes you will use them for good."
She looked up at him and smiled, saying, "Do you believe that?" And he responded,
"I think so. But you must first learn to control your anger. Like last night. And maybe we can be a team and fight evil together."
She laid her head upon his shoulder and said, "Really, Bjorn? Can we ever be together? Can you ever forgive me for breaking your heart?"
"Forgive you, yes. Be together, I don't know. There is nothing I want more, but first I need to find out what or who I really am. For now, I am just happy to be right here."
She kissed him and said, "Bjorn, on this day forward my heart belongs to you. And if you want to fight evil, I will be at your side." "Oh, one more question," said Lizzie. "How did you know I wouldn't kill Dorian?"
"I didn't,"
he said, and pulled her close as they kissed under the starry sky. And titled, Under the Wicked Moon. Let's get straight into that. Prologue. Evil depends upon the monster within. Part 1. The Hinterlands. In the uttermost hinterlands of Northumbria, an eerie full moon shone high over a quiet remote forest. The silence was pierced by the sound of a horse galloping and snorting as its breath steamed the cold night air. At first its hooves were like a low rumble, but the intensity increased. A young woman straddled the horse and held tightly to the reins as they dodged trees at a full gallop. She would duck under limbs and branches by leaning over and clinging to the horse's side while slapping it with the reins. This steed was running from something that was gaining on it. Trees crashing in the distance behind them could be heard, muffling the snarling sound. But this was no normal snarl. It was a primal, guttural growl. The young woman shouted, "Yah!" and pointed the horse towards a clearing ahead. It burst out of the trees and into a meadow, illuminated by the intense moonlight. The horse now put distance between it and whatever was pursuing it. But as the horse and rider arrived in the middle of the meadow, they suddenly stopped, and the rider dismounted before the galloping steed could come to a full stop. A tall, statuesque woman with a hooded cloak landed solidly on the ground and squared up to face whatever was pursuing her. And suddenly, a huge beast running on all fours burst from the tree line and halted halfway with a curious look, cocking its head. And the young woman shouted, "You want me, you filthy beast? Come get me!" This abomination was filled with rage and barreled towards her. She did not flinch but stood her ground, as if she was prepared to meet this vicious predator head on. And a huge wolf-like creature with yellow eyes roared as it approached at a dizzying speed. The young woman abruptly threw back her cloak and produced two short swords from sheaths on her back. She held one in front and the other over her head at an angle as it reflected the moonlight into the beast's face. The beast had slid to a stop within feet of this motionless woman as she stood holding her position. This monstrous wolf, still confused, cocked its head again and studied this mysterious woman. It was as if it asked itself why she isn't running in terror for her life like all the other humans or animals had done. But it didn't stay frozen for long, and apparently its hunger for flesh got the better of it. It crouched lower and lunged, taking a swipe at the lady. Within a split second, she sidestepped and swung the overhead blade severing the monster's right hand as it aimed its claws at her face. A piercing roar reverberated throughout the forest as it caused the bark to dislodge from the trees. The monster was now on its knees, clutching its severed stump and staring at the woman with a look of pure rage. She again held her ground and calmly said, "If you want to keep your other hand, you will stay right there and tell me where your pack is." I stood up as if ready to pounce. She shouted, "Tell me, or I will kill you quickly." And the beast did not respond. It made an evil snarl, and just as it started to lunge, a sword pierced it from the back, and the point emerged through its shoulder. Suddenly the beast was pulled up into the air, and then hit the ground with a large thud that aided it for a moment.
Bjorn and Lizzie stood over the beast as it lay gasping in the moonlit meadow. Bjorn's hulking frame took a huge stride towards it and pressed his sword into the creature's throat and said, "This lass asked you where your pack is." The creature only snarled and gasped as it lay seemingly helpless on its back and with the point of the blade piercing its skin. Lizzie looked up at Bjorn and said, "Can they not talk when near death?" "Speak, foul beast," said Bjorn. "I know you can talk when near death or transformation." And suddenly the creature became agitated as it growled and snapped its jaws and moved its mouth. It lunged forward, causing the sword to pierce its throat, and it gargled on its own blood, and then drew its last breath. "Could you understand it?" said Lizzie. "No, I only felt its despair and desperation. But in my mind, I know it was trying to communicate something to me."
"So now what?" said Lizzie.
"We load it in a wagon and take it to King Philip as proof he seeks."
Lizzie shook her head and said, "Are you going to put this terrible smelling thing in a wagon while we off to sleep?"
"Yes," he replied. "I will wrap it in animal skins."
Bjorn mused and Lizzie asked what was on his mind.
"Father David told us that werewolves are but people transformed. Legend says they can speak when near death or in transformation. But it is as if this creature was in a natural state. You know we are to take it to Father Thomas first. Maybe he can shed light on this mystery before we meet with King Philip's guard. But for now, let's go. It's a full day's journey into the night. And unlike me, you must sleep."
Then they set off for the castle in the far north to deliver the amazing cargo. Part 2. Fear sets in. Let's get straight into that. As the wagon approached the castle, in the distance there were many bonfires and torches on the grounds outside the gates. Lizzie commented that there must be some kind of autumn festival. Bjorn shook his head slowly.
"No, it appears people have set up tents and encampments in the field. Something doesn't feel right. Fear hangs in the air."
The two trod on with their horses in tow behind the wagon, their cargo becoming ever more fragrant. They pulled up to the huge chapel just beyond the gates. An intern fetched Father Thomas to greet them. With open arms, he greeted both with a warm smile, saying, "Father David has penned several letters to me about you two. It is my pleasure," as he made the sign of the cross and blessed them. "It is late. Come in and eat."
"Not yet,"
Bjorn replied.
"We have a sinister cargo to reveal,"
as he pulled back the tarp, causing the father to gasp and cross himself. Father Thomas snapped at the young priest to run and alert Captain Landry and bring hardy men with a wagon. He had the young intern pull the wagon out of sight from any nearby curious eyes. Captain Landry arrived with 4 guards and 2 stablemen with a wagon and the still breathless young priest, Theo. He made the introductions and had Bjorn uncover the smelly beast. Captain Landry immediately blurted out, "Sweet mother of God," as the other guards mumbled and crossed themselves. "We must let the king and keep this quiet," said Father Thomas. "I must bring him here," said Landry.
"There is much fear and speculation in the air. Villagers have already turned upon each other with allegations of witchcraft or accusations of their neighbors in league with Lucifer."
He bartered his men to stand guard and let no one pass until his return. "So, Father," said Lizzie, "why are all these people camped out here?" "They are terrified, lass. Many have lost livestock, some lost family. Most have heard the haunted howls echoing through the hills. And now my worst fears have come true. This is not just a changeling, but a devil's spawn." Within the hour, a nondescript wagon approached with 4 more guards on horseback. The wagon pulled around to the side of the chapel, where King Philip discreetly exited the wagon, telling no one to bow for fear of drawing attention. And he gazed at the creature for only a few seconds and ordered Captain Landry to store it in the underground chamber for now. After entering the chapel, Bjorn and Lizzie bowed and presented a letter to King Philip from Queen Olivia. "Rise," said the king. "You need no introduction or letter. You will operate under my official seal from this point forward.
We are in your debt for slaying this foul abomination. I have a kingdom of terrified people, and I need only to know what resources will be required of me and my god. Tonight, you two must eat and rest, for tomorrow brings a cruel reality for us all. Please, join me at the palace for breakfast. Captain Landry will double the guard and light more fires about the palace grounds tonight. Father Thomas ushered Lizzie and Bjorn, telling them the wagon will be cleaned at first light. Bjorn scratched his chin and said, "Leave it be, Father. This scent shall be a bait for our hunt." And Lizzie gave Bjorn quite the look. Part 3. The hunt begins. At first light, a carriage arrived at the chapel to collect Bjorn and Lizzie, and Father Thomas to join the king at his table. They entered a room full of landowners and earls from around the countryside, clamouring until they saw the statuesque couple, and the chatter fell to only whispers. The king introduced them and said, "My people here have seen the beast. You have their ears." And Bjorn asked where the majority of the attacks had been. Have any new people arrived, or new settlements or farms been built? And the one name that resonated more than once was a mysterious man from France named Le Barbare, who had started a farm with about a dozen followers in the rocky hills of this outermost area of the kingdom. The handful of people who had met him shared their opinion that any attempt to farm or raise stock on this rocky ground was futile, but that did not seem to deter him, and Bjorn and Lizzie determined that they must meet this mysterious Frenchman. And they would pretend to be newlyweds looking for a homestead and head out at first light. And the king's guards would be placed at villages or farms in the area and will use signal fires and flaming arrows to communicate. Travelling into the hinterlands proved to be a task. The terrain, it was difficult, and many homesteads were deserted. An ominous heavy feeling hung over these rocky, desolate hills. Bjorn remarked that he had not sensed such evil since being in the Bloodlands. "Yes," said Lizzie. "There is a heavy feeling that makes me uneasy." Suddenly Bjorn stopped the wagon and said, "Shh," and the hills were silent and devoid of the usual nature sounds. Bjorn dismounted the wagon and untied his horse from the rear of the wagon. He mounted up and rode ahead about 10 strides after telling Lizzie to follow slowly and remain vigilant. And as they rounded a bend in the road, a small farmhouse came into sight. The horses began to snort and act erratic as they tried to calm them. A small barn with a fence in front lay to the left and behind the house. Bjorn and Lizzie drew closer as they started to see a picture of carnage. A putrid smell suddenly permeated their nostrils as the sounds of flies buzzed about. A large portion of the fence lay broken, and the barn door torn from its hinges. A horse and 2 cows lay mangled on the ground. Bjorn and Lizzie slowly dismounted and loosely tied off their horses. They crept towards the animals, Bjorn with his sword drawn, and Lizzie with an arrow knocked on her bow. The animals were brutally slaughtered, with entrails partially eaten and strewn about. Bjorn motioned for Lizzie to follow as they crept towards the small house, its front door completely missing. A dried blood trail tracking out of the front door was visible. Bjorn pulled the hood off his cloak and over his head and slowly took a step inside the door, with Lizzie and Trail ready to fire an arrow. And what lay on the floor caused Bjorn to flash back to that scene in his own home when his mother was slaughtered. The butchered remains of a man and woman lay on the floor, along with the broken contents of this simple home. Bjorn's blood ran cold as he knelt to take in the sights and smells. He pointed to the blood trails and said, "There are 2 trails here that do not belong to these poor souls." They made their way outside and cautiously followed the trails. Bjorn paused and pointed ahead and to the right towards a cluster of trees. They pushed on to discover the pitiful sight of 2 children, no more than 10 to 12 years old. They were butchered like those in a house, with entrails missing. Part 4. Predator or Prey. Let's get straight into that. After giving the remains a proper burial, Bjorn and Lizzie said a quick prayer and resolved to kill who or what was responsible for this massacre.
The sun was now sinking behind the trees, and Lizzie had an idea. "Let's quickly mend the fence and put our horses there for the night. If these monsters were attracted here before, well, surely more horses and the smell of the wagon should attract them again. And Father Thomas said a wicked red moon would hang in the sky for 2 nights. Bjorn nodded and said, "Yes, we will keep watch from the safety of the house, and I will make ready a huge signal fire." As nightfall came, the horses were inside the fence, and now seemingly at ease. With the sounds of nature, they slowly returned to the forest. Bjorn and Lizzie lit a candle and ate their rations, and huddled against the wall under the dim light. It was now getting late, and Bjorn kissed Lizzie on the cheek, saying, "My dearest, get some sleep, and I will remain at watch." She smiled and curled under a blanket and dozed off to sleep. But Bjorn was not at ease and sensed great danger. And shortly after midnight, Bjorn shot to his feet just as the horses began to snort and scratch the ground with their hooves. Again, the sounds of nature had gone silent, and Bjorn's senses tingled as something sinister filled the night air. He turned to awake Lizzie as she stood at the ready with her bow and arrow in hand. And suddenly there was the sound of horses in distress outside. Bjorn donned his hood and told Lizzie to follow 3 paces behind. 2 ominous figures stood tall over the horses as Bjorn's wings sprouted and he took flight. Lizzie fired an arrow, striking one of the creatures in the chest before it could sink its long claws into her horse. She then turned and put another arrow into the shoulder of the other beast. They both turned their attention to Lizzie and charged with a menacing howl that shook the entire body as she drew another arrow. These gigantic wolves were almost upon her when she fired another arrow into the throat of the closest beast, causing it to immediately fall and roll on the ground. There was no time to fire another arrow as she drew her sword from her back, and she braced herself and took a stance as the other one was one stride from being upon her. Suddenly, the beast was swept off its feet and then slammed into the earth with a thud that shook the ground beneath her. Before the creature could jump to its feet, Bjorn stood over it with his sword pointed into its neck. A sick, gurgling sound erupted as his peripheral vision caught Lizzie beheading the other beast. As he pushed the point of his blade into this giant man-wolf's throat, he said, "Speak, you foul abomination! Where is your leader?" The creature only growled and wiggled while snapping his gaping jaws. Lizzie called out, "Look, Bjorn, this one did not transform either." Bjorn scowled as he stared down at the beast. "Talk to me if you would live." And as he pressed the blade yet deeper into its neck, the creature acted as though it was trying to communicate as it made growling and yipping sounds. Lizzie stood watching guard in all directions as a puzzled look came over Bjorn's face. He calmly said, "Yes, I will." He quickly swung his blade, beheading the giant wolf. Lizzie shook her head in complete confusion. "Bjorn, why did you say that? Why did you say, 'Yes, I will'?" And Bjorn responded, "At first I thought this tortured creature begged for mercy, for its life. But in truth it pled me mercy for its tortured soul. And so I gave it the release it requested." "You mean you understood it?" said Lizzie. "What else did it tell you?" "Not much," said the stoic Bjorn. "Only that it was trapped and in despair. It simply wanted to be free of this curse, and I knew I could release it. But I did see an image of a canyon surrounded by rocky rolling hills. Let us tend to the horses and make our plan for tomorrow. But now I shall set the signal fire to alert the king's guard." Part 6. Stalking the Beasts. At first light, Bjorn and Lizzie were up preparing for their journey. The horses had scratches on their hind quarters, but nothing that wasn't easily treated by a herbal dressing. And Lizzie said, "I will leave a note for the guard that we travel northwest for a dark canyon surrounded by rolling rocky hills." And as the bright morning sun peeked above the trees, they were off on their trek in search of these creatures and their leader. After their fire burned throughout the early morning darkness, they anticipated that a detachment of the King's Guard would be en route. As they rode along on the wagon horses in tow, Lizzie asked Bjorn if he had a plan. He paused. I saw a dark foreboding place. 'Tis a place I must see from the air. Pull into the tree line and park the wagon.
And Bjorn gathered another set of his clothing and stuffed it with boughs and small branches, so as to tie it into a sitting position in the wagon seat next to Lizzie. And he said,
I will take leave through the heavy foliage. When nightfalls draw near, park the wagon in the trees and loosely tie the horses, should they need escape. Then mount your horse and ride on. I will remain vigil from above and provide a signal for you.
She kissed him and said, I feel heaviness. And with a hug, he nodded and crept away quietly through the brush. Lizzie pushed on with her fake Bjorn next to her and pretended to converse with him. As the shadows grew long, the blood moon was already starting to rise in the crystal clear early evening sky. In the distance, howls echoed through the hills that caused Lizzie to feel a chill up her spine. And she said to herself, They know we are coming. At this point, Lizzie pulled the wagon into the trees, loosely tied the horses, and then mounted hers. Her skin tingled, and something told her to ride towards the middle of the clearing she had just left. And from the opposite tree line, there came a crashing sound, as if trees were being knocked down or uprooted. Suddenly, two large dark figures erupted from the tree line, barreling towards her. She screamed, Yah! And heeled her horse in the sides and sped off in a northwesterly direction. Fortunately, the moonlight lit the rocky meadow, and she could see the rocks to avoid them. And as she looked up and ahead, she saw her signal. The rainbow-colored glimmer of Bjorn's sword in the sky. The two creatures pursuing her this time were larger and louder than the ones from the previous night. Bjorn was now perched in the top of a huge tall tree, overlooking a dark foreboding canyon and with small shacks dotting the area. All of his senses cried out that this was a place of unmatched evil. The area was devoid of all nature sounds, not even an insect. There were bone piles and carcasses of all types strewn about, even human. In the distance, he heard howls that caused him to fear Lizzie was in grave danger. The rest of this sinister pack now slowly started to emerge from their huts as the blood moon now sat on the rim of the canyon, like a sinister portrait from a horror story. Then three monsters broke off and ran rapidly in Lizzie's direction. Bjorn needed to warn her, but could not afford to reveal himself until the proper time. He now estimated that there was no less than a dozen of these abominations, but yet Le Barbare had not shown himself. At that instant, the rest of the pack fell silent as a tall dark mass emerged from a cave in the side of the canyon. There was no doubt that this tall black wolf with crimson streaks in its hair was Le Bear, the Barbarian. Lizzie rode along at a breakneck speed, but the wolves were slowly gaining on her. She abruptly took the reins in her mouth and spun around to the rear, drawing her bow and nocking an arrow. She allowed her horse to slow in order to draw the wolves in closer. Closer and closer they got as she tried to breathe and steady her aim. Then, suddenly she loosed another arrow, tipped in silver, that Father Thomas had given her. Straight the arrow flew and struck the lead beast in its lower right abdomen, causing it to grab for its belly and break stride, tumbling like an avalanche of arms and legs. The creature howled and pulled out the arrow and attempted to resume the chase, but quickly bent double, grabbing at its stomach. The silver was blessed by holy water. It was burning like fire, and the beast collapsed. The other creature slowed and turned to look at the sight of his companion in agony. It made a mistake of stopping with its back to Lizzie, and suddenly an arrow erupted through its chest, as it howled, falling to its knees. Lizzie whirled around on a road, not knowing what was hurtling toward her. No more than 5 miles to the southeast, a detachment of the King's Guard, numbering 20, now rode uneasily towards the howls that echoed through the dark hills. Part 7. Courage, Steel, and Desperation. Let's get straight into that. Bjorn swooped from the tall treetop, bearing down for where this black creature stood. But Le Bear sensed danger and quickly backed into the cave entrance, and 3 large snarling wolves put themselves in front of the cave. The one farthest to the left had no chance to react as Bjorn cleaved his sword down through its neck and spine, His sword shimmer caused the other two to stare spellbound. The middle beast lost its head in an instant as Bjorn spun and swung it as if in slow motion. The last beast pounced through the air, swiping its long claws towards Bjorn's head, but the claws met Bjorn's cloak and had no effect. This giant wolf stood staring in awe, not understanding why its prey did not fall. And this hesitation proved fatal when Bjorn thrust his sword up through this creature's chest, lifting it off the ground, and with a loud groan he flung it into the cave entrance at the feet of the shocked bear. "Who are you?" he snarled as he sprung forward like a bolt of lightning, swiping at Bjorn. Bjorn sidestepped, and the bear tumbled out of the cave entrance and rolled down the hillside. And just as Bjorn squared up with him, he was struck from behind by a huge brown mass, and they now tumbled over the rocky hillside. Suddenly Bjorn and the creature sprang to their feet just as this 8-foot monster clamped its jaws onto his shoulder. And he thrust his dagger up through its throat and into its mouth. The beast threw back its head and howled so loud that the sound actually dislodged some small loose rocks from the hillside. Lizzie was now close enough to hear the howl from about a mile ahead. Her skin started to tingle as she sensed that she was in danger. 100 yards ahead, a huge dark creature suddenly appeared, running on all fours at a staggering speed. She knocked an arrow and then fired, and instinctively veered towards the tree line. Her arrow glanced off the beast's chest and lodged in its thigh, causing it to tumble to a stop and howl in pain. But there was no time to relax now, because 2 more creatures were surging toward her at a 45-degree angle from her right. Lizzie reasoned that her horse, along with her masterful riding skills, could weave through the trees, buying her some time to fire an arrow here and there. But unknown to her, one of the creatures had taken to the trees, leaping from limb to limb high above. She realized she had lost sight and sound of both creatures, and made a break for the clearing, with the arrow knocked and drawn. And she barely emerged from the tree line. She spun to the rear and observed the beast not 30 feet behind her. She loosed the arrow, striking the beast in the chest, and jumped off her horse as it swung down, striking her steed. She fired one more arrow into the creature's back as it tried to turn. And suddenly, the treetops above, only 45 feet away, erupted from a shaking and snapping sounds. The beast started to leap down at her as she reached behind to discover her arrow quiver had fallen off. But just as quickly as the beast had leapt, it seemed to catch its leg on something, and then immediately went limp. She tried for an instant to adjust her eyes to see what had happened, but the trees were so dark. But she didn't have time to question her good fortune and mounted her injured horse to ride on. Bjorn and Lebar collided with a thunderous sound, his blade slashing the beast's shoulder. Lebar countered and lunged at Bjorn's side, knocking him down. Lebar was not only bigger, but stronger and faster than the rest. Bjorn sprung to his feet just to be overrun from the rear by 2 beasts who took him to the ground. A massive struggle erupted as Bjorn and the creatures rolled down the hill, with more closing in to join the fray. Arrows started to pepper the wolves as a horse and rider emerged into the mouth of the canyon, not 100 yards away. Several of the beasts screamed as the blessed silver arrow tips burned like fire. Bjorn now fought 4 creatures as Lizzie fired her last arrow, sinking into the creature's neck. She dismounted and rode while the horse still galloped, emerging on her feet with swords drawn. Putting herself between Bjorn and the others, she battled the monsters. More than a dozen of these giant wolves stood on their hind legs, snarling and showing their teeth at Lizzie. The odds were not good, as one by one the pack started to advance towards her, getting even faster. The howls were now deafening. Lizzie strode forward and ducked under the first beast, severing its leg at the knee. She jumped laterally with the grace of a deer and swung down, slicing into another creature's face and jaw, causing it to grab at its face and howl in pain. And she now squared up with 5 or 6 wolves charging at her no more than 3 strides away. And even though Bjorn had killed 1 wolf and seriously injured another, 2 monsters still tried to sink their teeth into him. Part 8. A Blade Through the Heart. Just as it looked as though there was no way for Bjorn and Lizzie to escape or prevail, a resounding crack like thunder, followed by a thud, was was heard over the growls and yelps vibrating the ground. A quick but cold rush of wind blew over the ferocious pack, bearing down upon Lizzie. They suddenly turned their heads to see an ominous dark figure standing not 100 feet behind them, and raised their heads to sniff the air. They looked at one another puzzled, as if they didn't recognize this smell. The figure seemed to be that of a large cloaked man, easily 7 feet tall. Some of the beasts growled. Some of them seemed to almost whimper, as if in fear. From a distance, Le Barbare shouted, "Attack, you spineless cowards!" in a guttural voice, and many of the pack charged towards this mysterious figure as it remained motionless. Lizzie wasted no time and cleaved one of her swords down on the neck and the spine of the closest one, dropping it instantly. 3 remained and squared off with her. She again ducked and swerved, and then mounted the back of the nearest creature, charging her. She managed to run her sword through its neck, and it tumbled, throwing her forwards with a loud thud. And as she rose to her feet, she was overrun by another beast who slashed her left arm and shoulder, sending her back to the ground and knocking her breathless. A dozen or so wolves that now ran towards the dark figure were almost upon him when he produced a giant sword that seemed to glimmer like an ice-blue flame. And with one sweep of the giant blade, he cleaved 3 creatures in half, and then jumped and tumbled forward, crushing the skull of another beast with the blade. He landed in the middle of the remaining monsters and threw back his cloak to reveal a pair of glowing blue eyes that seemed to paralyze the beasts. While they stood staring, he wasted no time beheading 2 more. He suddenly sprouted a set of wings and began darting about, cutting the wolves down one by one. 3 of them ran in fear towards the mouth of the canyon in the direction of the oncoming king's guard. Bjorn had just dispatched his last wolf and flew towards Lizzie, jerking the wolf off the ground that stood over her. In a rage of anger, he snapped the creature's neck and threw it towards the 2 remaining wolves. They froze in terror. That was a fatal mistake, because their winged companion took both of their heads from behind. And it was now over, except for Le Bar, who stood motionless on the hillside. Bjorn ran to Lizzie and wrapped a torn part of her garment around her wound. She nodded and said, "I'm okay," and looked towards Le Bar. Bjorn looked over his shoulder and at the other man, who nodded and said, "Shall we?" For some reason, Bjorn felt like he knew this stranger and could trust him. They both leapt through the air and landed about 3 strides away from Le Bar, who now began to slowly back up on the hillside, while snarling in a low, guttural manner. Bjorn sheathed his sword and said, "It is now just you and me. Will it be a merciful death or battle?" Le Bar tensed his body and crouched on all 4s, leapt at Bjorn. They locked in a pitched rolling battle, tumbling down the hill. Le Bar managed to bite down on Bjorn's shoulder, and one side of his teeth pierced a portion of Bjorn's shoulder and neck, not covered by his cloak. He grabbed Le Bar's neck with his powerful hand, while fending swipes from its claws with the other. Le Bar used his powerful legs to spring forward, slamming Bjorn onto his back. But Bjorn rolled backwards so fast that he was on top of the bar in less than a second. He slammed his fists into the side of the bar's head, idling him long enough to pull his sword and press the point to his heart. "If you want mercy, you will answer some questions," said Bjorn, as Lizzie and their winged friend now stood next to him. "Why do these werewolves not transform? Why are they so huge? And how did you become this way?" Le Bar smiled with a huge mouth of teeth and began to talk. Part 9. Secrets Revealed. Let's get straight into that. Le Bar spoke as Bjorn pressed his sword into his chest, and with his growling voice he told of being a former assassin for the King of France, who fell out of favour. "I was known as the Barbarian because I enjoyed killing. I began doing it for pleasure, even when not in the King's service. Finally, they threw me into a dungeon after I developed a taste for blood and human hearts. There I was, the King's finest assassin, chained in a dungeon. I cried out in anger and despair, and one night a handsome man dressed like a king appeared at the bars of my cell. He asked me just how badly I wanted my freedom. I told that I would do anything for a chance to escape. He opened the door and said, "If I loose you from these chains, will you serve me and help me build my kingdom?" I swore my allegiance to him. We walked out of that dungeon while the guards were sound asleep. We walked right through the gates unnoticed by guards and into the street to his carriage, and he presented me with a bag full of many small glass vials, and one large one. He told me if I drank this elixir, I would become powerful and have the ability to command many strong beasts that would do my bidding. I drank it, and the next thing I remembered was laying in the forest as the full moon rose. I transformed into the beast, a perfect predator, a perfect assassin. The concoction transformed me into this superb creature, and I knew that I must bite many people to build my own kingdom. The way I control them is through the elixir. They become my subjects, but I am the only one who can change. They remain giant wolves under my command. The sound of many horses' hooves could be heard in the distance as the king's guard rode towards them in the distance. Lizzie spoke up. "Holy Mother! His story sounds like what Count Vostok told me about the Bloodlands manor." Bjorn's new companion spoke in a deep voice to Labar. "What was this man's name?" "I do not know," snarled Labar. The stranger said, "I know his name," and then nodded to Bjorn and said, "You know what you must do. His heart is as black as soot, and he tortured people for no reason other than pleasure." Bjorn looked down at Labar and plunged his sword deep into his chest, piercing his heart. The creature struggled as blood gurgled out of its mouth. Bjorn then cut out the heart and held it on the end of his blade. The stranger pressed his large blade into it, and it erupted in flames. "Beheading is not enough for this one," he said. "The heart must be turned to ash and Labar transformed back to a man." The stranger turned to Lizzie and said, "Please, may I touch your injured arm?" And she nodded, and the man placed his large hand upon her arm, and in seconds it was healed. "Who are you? What are you?" said Lizzie. "I am Adoniel of the Gregori, sworn to serve the One on High." "I am one of you," said Bjorn. "Not exactly," he said, "but almost." "But where did I come from?" "You are your mother's child. You are the child she miscarried, but you were brought back for a purpose. That purpose is to find and stop a man named Lucian before he builds an army on Earth." "But who is he?" said Lizzie. "This impeccably dressed man is the son of the Evil One, the son of Perdition, the son of Lucifer himself." Bjorn responded, "How will we find him? How will we stop him?" "Now that you and Lizzie have destroyed his two best centurions, he may seek you out, and how you stop him is part of your trial." "Trial? What trial? Will you assist us again?" "Enough for now, children. I must go before I am seen." Lizzie looked up at Adoniel and said, "It was you in the trees." He nodded with a smile. He then placed his hands on Bjorn and Lizzie's shoulders and closed his eyes for a second. And then Bjorn and Lizzie did likewise. When they opened their eyes, he was gone. And the king's guard were now in sight. The horses trotting towards them. And Captain Landry dismounted and told them how they killed 3 giant wolves but lost 3 men and another 6 wounded. "We found your wagon and horses, abandoned, and brought them," said Landry. "Were the wounded bitten?" said Bjorn. "No, only clawed," responded Landry. "The dead, or they must be burned," said Bjorn. Landry rubbed his chin and said, "What happened here?
Did you two kill them all? More or less, said Bjorn. But there is much to discuss. Let us clean up this place and tend to your men. Father Thomas and the king no doubt await anxiously. We must leave at first light.
After a long day's ride to the church, the father greeted them late that night, and they shared what had happened.
We must tell the king first thing in the morning, said the father. But first, come eat, and then you two must rest.
Bjorn awoke early and told of having a strange dream about an island in the Mediterranean with a dark cloud hanging over it. The king graciously thanked them and invited Bjorn and Lizzie to stay. Bjorn responded,
Thank you, your majesty, but we must go. A great evil may be seeking us, and we must find it first. I will send letters ahead to the kings of France and Rome, and to the church fathers. I will provide a ship and safe passage all the way.
Bjorn and Lizzie bowed and took their leave to prepare for the long journey. And as they ready to depart, Father Thomas took them by the hand and said,
My children, an ancient evil looms that will test the strength of your very souls.
Epilogue. The road to perdition is paved with dark ambition. And title: The Bloodlands. The finale: The Island. Let's get straight into that. Prologue. From one seed comes a great evil. Part 1. A revealing journey. During the trip to the Mediterranean, Bjorn would sleep restlessly on the ship, dreaming of strange images in places where he felt as though he had been before. He had visions of men whom he believed were his companions, and then there were other men, very large, dressed in strange and ancient-looking armor. He couldn't help but have an overwhelming feeling that everything he had experienced thus far was leading him here to some final event. And it was just before sunrise, as the boat docked and a representative of the church named Jago met them. Bjorn paused and held his head up in the air and sniffed the ocean breeze. Oh, there was a smell in the air that should not be there. It was a smell he recognized from his past. Now, the mysterious island of Yara lay in the distance, barely visible to the naked eye, but Bjorn could see it well, along with the dark, ominous cloud that hung over it. Please, allow me to take you to meet Father Lorenzo, said Jago. Bjorn and Lizzie were to meet the father at a private location away from the church, and they were ushered to a large stone structure near the docks. Inside awaited the father, with 4 guards and 3 mysterious men standing in the background.
Welcome, said Father Lorenzo. There is much to discuss, and there are dark times in the Mediterranean. The seed of fear has been planted, and the people are frightened from this feeling of dread that hangs in the air.
Now, folk had rolled in every evening for the last several days and hung low over the old cobblestone streets, and some of the church fathers believed that the devil himself was amongst them. A few churches had boarded up their entrances, others had guards, and some had locked their doors altogether. Now, people hurried about in the streets and made sure to be home well before dark. The sounds of children playing was obviously missing, and no birds were singing or chirping in the trees. People looked down as they walked about quickly, not making eye contact or speaking to friends and family. Priests were reluctant to discuss what was going on. The Pope had not ventured out for a month, and strange ships had been seen by fishermen sailing to the island of Yara. Things were unloaded under the cover of darkness on this deserted volcanic island. Animals and people were missing from neighbouring islands, and there were no longer any fish in the waters from around the island. And people were nervous because of the mysterious lights seen from the desolate clump of volcanic rock. The church fathers had been keeping an eye on it from afar with a telescope, and had observed a dark cloud start to form over the island and get bigger each day. An eerie red glow faintly illuminated the cloud at night, giving it an even more foreboding look. And the small ship where soldiers were sent to investigate, but they never returned.
and after a few days, yet another ship was sent to look for them, and it had not returned either. In the background behind Father Lorenzo stood 3 mysterious men with white cloaks bearing a star and with a cross inside it. Bjorn stared at them and this emblem because it was almost identical to his birthmark. The lead man spoke. "I am Gideon. We are among the last members from the Order of the Holy Temple. We are sworn to protect ancient secrets and fight against evil until the end of times. These are my associates, Aaron and Joel. We stand steadfast with you and the lady, ready to assist you in your quest. We have travelled far, tracking a sinister but well-dressed man from the Middle East, bringing what we believe to be forbidden artifacts to the island on ships." Gideon looked at Bjorn and said, "Please, come with me. I believe we have something that is meant for you." It took both of Gideon's associates to pull a large, ancient-looking shield from the burlap sack. Bjorn instantly saw that the markings upon it were like those on his sword, and his eyes froze on the shield. Then Gideon produced one more item from the large bag. It was a helmet made in the same fashion as the shield. Bjorn paused and spoke. "There is something very familiar about this. I think maybe it was once mine," he said. When Bjorn reached forward his hand for the helmet, there was a small static, like discharge, as he touched it. When he donned the helmet and braced the shield, he instantly fell into a trance-like state. Part 2. Piercing the Veil. Let's get straight into that. The stoic Bjorn now stood silent like a statue as he gripped his sword and held the shield at the ready against his chest. It started to shimmer just as his sword did the first time he had held it. A pale blue light now emanated from around him. Lizzie suggested that they all move back a few steps. Bjorn's head tilted forward, and it was as if he was transported out of his body to another place and time. Suddenly, he was surrounded by other men who were adorned in a similar fashion to him. Adoniel was there and looked at him with a nod. They were inside a tremendous cavern in the bowels of the earth. There were thin layers of smoke suspended in the air, and the smell of sulphur hung heavy. The other large men advanced slowly but deliberately forward, ahead of him with shields raised and swords in hand. And as they trod deeper into this hellish place, Adoniel leaned into Bjorn's ear and said, "This is a test from your past, and it is a reminder of what lies ahead of you." Bjorn was anxious but not afraid, and somehow he knew that he had been here before. A pale rainbow of colours now began to emanate from the men in front of him, giving a hazy air and unearthly hue. In the distance, a wave of unnatural, blood-curdling screams erupted that echoed throughout the cave. The terrifying sounds were now rapidly approaching and becoming deafening. The men in front abruptly formed a wedge with their shields and held their swords at the ready over the shields. Bjorn followed suit as he saw that Adoniel was now 3 strides in front of him. Suddenly, a wave of deformed dark shapes slammed into the shield wall in front of him, with a sound like thunder vibrating the cavern around him. Out of his peripheral vision, Bjorn noticed carvings on the cave wall, depicting all sorts of hellish creatures. Under the carvings was what looked like some sort of makeshift stone altar. Ahead, a hideous cacophony of vile man-like creatures, resembling a combination of goats, serpents, and lions, poured over the men, while they skewered and beheaded monster after monster. Some of the creatures even had tentacles like sea creatures. Adoniel now began cutting them down as they swiped their claws and snapped their huge sharp teeth. And suddenly, Bjorn was in the fight of his life as he sensed several creatures now surrounding him on all sides. He slammed his shield into one creature whilst thrusting his sword up into the gut of another and flung it onto the ground. He whirled around and began slashing and beheading the beasts one after the other. He sliced and hacked at the creatures as they fell one by one. The grotesque bodies were now starting to pile up around him. But the next thing he knew, he was awake and standing back in front of Lizzie and the 3 strangers. "What happened?" said Lizzie. Bjorn paused and told him how he was transported to a place deep inside the earth, fighting hideous monsters with Adoniel and other Gregori. It was like I had been there before, and I was reliving this experience. Gideon spoke up and said, "Was a large and mysterious man who came to us at the temple, with a bundle containing the shield and helmet. He knew we were about to depart on our quest for the Mediterranean. He said that we would meet a man whom this belonged."
Bjorn nodded and said,
"Yes, that man was the same man in my vision."
Gideon announced that it was now time to set sail for the short trip to the mysterious island of Yara, and he feared that we must prepare for an ancient evil.
"We have brought weapons procured from holy sites, weapons that hold great power." "Very well," said Bjorn. "Let us set sail."
During the journey, Bjorn decided to sprout his wings and fly ahead to investigate the island. He would return and tell them where to beach the boat. Upon arriving at the island, the air was heavy, and at times it felt hard for Lizzie and the knights to breathe. They tied the boat off on a boulder and proceeded over the rocky shoreline. Human remains were scattered about, no doubt those of the soldiers sent to investigate. They observed many caves and caverns on the island. There appeared a very large cave that had obviously been unsealed. Once inside this huge cave entrance, they observed that it had contained many strange carvings on the wall, depicting men of huge stature. And Gideon said,
"Legend held that this was once home to a race of giants."
And at that instant, the ground slightly rumbled from under their feet. Echoing sounds like loud whispers filled their ears. Gideon said that ancient burial sites in the Mideast had been opened and raided, and they feared their contents had been brought here for evil purposes. Several ships carrying huge crates with ancient markings had been seen by fishermen from nearby islands. Gideon, Joel, and Aaron retrieved glass bottles of flammable liquid in slings, along with spears and arrows having etchings like Bjorn's sword and similar armor. Then Gideon pointed down into the cave and said,
"Look, the crates are there inside the cave, and signs that they were recently opened."
Bjorn observed even more ancient but familiar carvings on the cave wall.
"This is an ancient dwelling place of the damned," he said.
And as the five further inspected the cave, a rumbling sound came from deep within. Part 3. Horror Revealed. They quickly backed out of the entrance of the cave as a sea of ghoulish creatures emerged from the darkness, running about on all fours. Their legs bent macabrely forward at the knees, allowing them to scamper around like large, disfigured spiders. They were pale white with black eyes and had huge round mouths full of razor-sharp teeth. And when they opened their jaws, their mouths extended from their chins to their foreheads. Now Lizzie and the knights fired arrows and lit the fuses on the glass firebombs, slinging them at the creatures. Unearthly, ear-piercing screeches erupted as the abominations were engulfed in flames. Whatever was in these bottles was more than just simple lamp oil, as the creatures practically exploded into balls of flame on contact. Bjorn swept down, cleaving a beast in half. One jumped onto his back and he flung it into the path of the others, running towards Lizzie and the knights, causing them to get tripped up. Gideon and his men drew swords and began dispatching them, but two of the creatures jumped onto Joel's back, ripping and tearing at him with their claws and teeth, and pulling chunks of flesh from his neck and shoulders before Gideon and Aaron could behead them. The remaining handful of the monsters converged on them as Lizzie drew her swords and hacked away, standing back to back with Gideon and Aaron. Bjorn landed next to them, cutting two creatures in half instantly. Lizzie ran one sword up through the throat of one and swung sideways her other sword, laying wide the throat of yet another, as Gideon and Aaron vanquished the last two. They ran to check on Joel, but he was already dead. Most of his throat was missing. And as the four bowed with Gideon saying a prayer, the sound of applause was heard coming from within the cave. A sneering, maniacal voice said, "Bravo! It appears you have killed my little pets." They turned to see a handsome man looking like royalty, dressed in the finest of clothes. It was Lucian, Satan's spawn, the son of perdition. How appropriate that I finally get to meet the two who so aptly killed my centurions and their followers. And look, one is no less a junior Grigori.
The other reeks of my servant, Vostok. How is that possible? The ancient awe of the temple knights are even here. But worry not. Your suffering will be short-lived, for my servants come to make quick work of you. And then, from the shallow darkness behind Lucian, a steady thud, 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 came as several large shadowy figures started to emerge. One by one, giant men emerged dressed in an ancient manner, wearing battle armor. They ranged from 8 to 10 feet tall in height and looked as if their skin was partially decayed. In places, you could see bones under the decayed flesh, and they gave off a foul stench that seemingly came from the pits of hell. Lucian proudly bowed and spoke again, saying, "Lady and gentlemen, please allow me to introduce Anikale, and Og Yavesh of the Amorites, Rav Kanan and Binobel of the Canaanites, Moabil and Basharil of the Moabites, Saf Algob and Gathlami of the Philistines, and Raphafarat, protector of the great Pharaoh. My father reanimated these giants with the ancient dark fire of life for a second chance to rule. And you two who killed my centurions will pay a price. After these great warriors have trampled your remains, I will sail these mighty Raphim to the shores of the mainland, where the worms of the church dwell. By sunrise they will bow to me and him who begat me, the brightest spirit of all. And before another sun rises, I will transform them into ghoulish servants like those you just slaughtered."
Lizzie and the knights felt uneasy and off balance, as if these giants were emanating a force that caused them slight nausea in the pit of their stomachs. Then, from behind Lucian came a series of low, guttural snarling growls, and only what could be described as 3 hellhounds with glowing red eyes, surrounding his feet. They had spikes on their backs, and their shoulders came above waist level on Lucian. Their teeth were long and razor-sharp and were coloured a dirty yellow-brown, and with a smelly saliva dripping from their mouths. Their breaths were hot, and steam emanated from their muzzles as they snarled. Lucian screamed, "Damn you all to hell!" And Gideon then responded, "That is the domain in which you shall dwell, not us." Part 4. The Showdown. Let's get straight into that. The giants began to advance, stepping in front of Lucian. Bjorn, and the largest giant, Anikale, squared off. He stood over 10 feet tall and threw a boulder at Bjorn, but he dodged it and leapt in, striking the behemoth's thigh with his sword. Anikale screamed out a roar that shook the surrounding rocks. A gaping hole exposed bone, and a black smelly clotted liquid oozed out from the gash. The giant swung his mighty sword, striking Bjorn's shield and knocking him to the ground. Bjorn tumbled backwards instantly, coming to his feet in a ready position. Courageous Lizzie pulled an arrow after arrow from her quiver and shot the blessed warheads towards the hulking men. The 8-foot-tall Gathlami screamed, "Woman, I am descended from Goliath of Gath, and this day you will lay with me." Lizzie responded, "Goliath lost his head, and so shall you." She fired an arrow, striking his thigh, causing him to scream out in pain. The arrow seemed to be having a moderate effect, but the flames caused the giants great pain. Gideon and Aaron emerged from behind Lizzie, firing arrows and lighting more firebombs. The giants were quite sensitive to the fire, and Saf Al-Gob erupted into flames and ran towards the ocean. But the giants moved with great speed and agility and were hard to hit. The battle between Bjorn and Anikale raged on, now with a great sword battle. Anikale had suffered a serious wound to his leg from Bjorn's sword and was now on the defensive. The 10-foot giant was stronger and swung his huge sword with great force, but Bjorn would block, sidestep, and slice Anikale with his sword, which now glimmered with a blue flame. And seeing that their comrade was now losing, Binabale, Moabil, and Basharil
began to run towards Anakale. Suddenly Bjorn was struck from behind by a large club with spikes wielded by Moabil, who stood almost as tall as Anakale. The remainder of the giants now moved against Lizzie and the knights, throwing huge stones that narrowly missed them. Gideon and Aaron managed to set another giant on fire, and the hulking Rafa ran for the sea to quench the flames. But the onslaught of the giants continued, and Ogyavesh quickly emerged from behind Aaron, picking him up and slamming him into the ground with a sickening thud. And with all the strength Aaron had left, he fired one more arrow, striking the 9-foot-tall giant in the face. But it wasn't enough to stop the hulking Ogyavesh from stomping its giant foot into Aaron's chest. Now only Lizzie and Gideon stood alone, facing Gaf Lamé, Rav Kanan, and the wounded Ogyavesh. Suddenly, the severely burned Rafa and Saf al-Gob emerged from the sea with great rage after extinguishing their flamed flesh. They rushed out of the surf with lumps of burnt flesh falling onto the rocky ground. They held their huge battle axes over their heads as they charged forward, with only one focus, and that was exacting their revenge against Lizzie and Gideon. Bjorn was now airborne, dodging small boulders, while Lizzie was down to the last of her remaining arrows, and Gideon was lighting the last of the firebombs. Suddenly, there was a crack of thunder and lightning that struck the ground 50 or 60 feet behind the oncoming giants. 3 shafts of brilliant blue light hit the ground with such force it knocked the giants off balance. As the dust and smoke cleared, 3 large figures stood near the shoreline with hoods of their cloaks obscuring their faces. The warm, humid air now felt cold, and the chill was felt by the giants. They turned and stood motionless, staring at these figures who were now quite visible. They wore armor and held shields like Bjorn's, and they suddenly produced giant swords and threw back their cloaks. It was Adoniel, and 2 men even larger than him. Wings abruptly emerged from their backs, and they shot forward towards the giants. 2 of them went towards Lizzie and Gideon, and Adoniel went towards Bjorn. Rafa and Saf al-Gob squared off to meet the 2 Gregori, and both lost their heads in a flash. Adoniel rushed forward towards Ben-Abil, Moabil taking a blow from Ben-Abil's sword on his shield, and blocking an overhead attack from Moabil's spiked club with his glowing sword. Moabil froze and looked down at the stump of what was once his sword, only a second before. Adoniel wasted no time and spun around, taking Moabil's head. Adoniel turned his attention to the stunned Ben-Abil, who rushed towards him. Part 5. Fire, Still, and Decision. The 2 Gregori who joined Lizzie and Gideon now faced off against Rav Kanan and Ogyavesh as Gathlami glared with rage at Lizzie. Gideon lit his last firebomb and threw it at Gathlami's feet. When it fell short, the giant opened his huge mouth and laughed, saying, "Beautiful, weak human!" Then Lizzie took her remaining arrow and fired it right into the giant's open mouth. He staggered backwards, screaming in a thunderous manner, and Saf al-Gob and Rafa were engaged in a sword fight with the 2 Gregori, and were being slashed to pieces. Bjorn and Basharil were now locked into a sword battle as Anakale stumbled to his feet and with blood streaming from the huge gash in his leg. And as Gathlami pulled the arrow out of his mouth, Gideon distracted him from the front, while Lizzie quickly came from behind, jumping onto the giant's back. She struck one of her swords deep into his neck, causing him to fling her off as if she was a small child, and she landed hard onto the ground. Gathlami stumbled forward to his knees, and Gideon rushed forward with his sword and shouted, "For Aaron and Joe!" and severed the behemoth's head. As this was happening, Ogyavesh and Rav Kanan went out on their knees, bleeding profusely from numerous wounds, as the 2 Gregori stood over them. With 2 swings in unison, they took their heads. Ben-Abil now slumped to his knees, missing his right arm from the elbow down. He held his shield up to block Adoniel's blow, but the blade split his shield down the middle, along with the giant's forearm. He fell forward onto his chest, and Adoniel took his head. Bjorn now battled the giant Basharil, who stood 2 heads taller, but Bjorn fought fiercely, blocking and countering, making cuts to the giant's midsection and legs. And finally, Bashariel became angry, careless, and swung his sword, overextending himself. When he did, Bjorn plunged his sword up through its heart, and the blade came out his back with a thick dark blood dripping off of it. And the Kale stumbled forwards and swung his sword down on Bjorn, with his back still turned. Lizzie screamed, but Bjorn had already begun to react. He turned about quickly, blocking the blow with his shield, and buried his blade deep into the bowels of the giant. He took his foot and kicked the giant back off his blade, and its body made a loud thud as it struck the ground on the rocky shoreline at Adoniel's feet, where he quickly severed its head. All attention was now turned to Lucian, standing in the cave entrance behind his hellhounds. There was a look of fear upon his face that slowly turned into a sneering grin as the three hounds crouched and snarled while whimpering a bit. Now Adoniel and his two companions approached, and Lucian spoke. "I see your master sent you after me." And Adoniel's booming voice spoke. "Your mischief is done. You will be bound in the earth along with the other sons of perdition." The three hellhounds suddenly leapt forward at the three Gogori, who caught them in midair, snapping their necks. The hounds fell to the ground, instantly bursting into flames. Adoniel produced a set of chains and handed them to Chamuel and Kemuel as they bound Lucian. He screamed, "The Most High can only bind me for a season. I shall return!" And the huge shaft of light struck the ground where Lucian and the two Gogori stood. When the cloud of smoke and dust dissipated, they were gone. Adoniel turned to Gideon and bowed his head, saying, "Well done, good servant. Today your men will have great reward." Gideon nodded, and Bjorn said, "And what now for Lizzie and I?" And Adoniel responded, "You have passed your test, my young brother. Today you must make an important choice. You may choose between continuing your service as a Gregori with the highest honor, or you may choose to be but a man again who can have a family." And Bjorn looked puzzled as Lizzie drew near. "And you, dear Lizzie, have fought nobly, and today all vestiges of Vostok's malfeasance will be removed from you." And Bjorn and Lizzie looked to each other in great wonder at what Adoniel had said. Adoniel now drew close and looked directly at Bjorn and Lizzie. "Should you both choose your previous lives, you will retain some of your abilities. For once obtained, some gifts are like burdens which cannot be discarded. You can be like any other man or woman and have a family, but you will always be stronger, more aware, and retain the hearts and senses of true warriors. Should you choose this, we will be looking over you until that day when you are again needed to serve the great cause." Bjorn looked at Lizzie and said, "What will you choose?" And she held his hand and said, "I once told you my heart would always be yours." Bjorn looked at Adoniel and said, "We choose each other." "So be it," said Adoniel. "You will keep your cloak and sword for that day when we call upon you. But for now, have a life and have love together. Raise strong children in the way your father raised you, and teach them about the ancient ways." Adoniel placed his hand on their foreheads, and for only a second they closed their eyes. When they opened them again, Adoniel was gone. Bjorn and Lizzie felt different. Gideon said, "Come, children, let me arrange passage back home for you. You have earned it." And with that, they prepared their return home to their land to spend their lives together. As their ship sailed home, Bjorn sat silent at the bow of the ship, looking up into the night sky. Lizzie knelt next to him, saying, "Your thoughts appear deep, my dear." Bjorn responded, "My love, you look different, youthful but mature. You are surrounded by millions of stars, but yet you shine." Then Lizzie responded, "You look almost like my youthful Bjorn, but in the body of a wiser man who had suffered many trials.
Yes,
said Bjorn,
but I feel our best trials are ahead.
As he stood to embrace her. They embraced and stared up into the clear night sky, where the ship gently rocked and swayed. They were headed home, where their journey had begun. Epilogue. The path home is paved with great sacrifice.